Hello everyone. Today my group and I will be presenting on bank impersonation scams in Singapore. First, I'll be going through an introduction of the case before diving into analysis of the ethical dilemmas and recommendations regarding it. First, let's go through the facts. In 2022, OCBC lost 13.7 million, with the total number of scam victims being 790. They found that there was a large influx of scam reports from 23rd to 30th December, which resulted in a 40% increase in calls to OCBC's contact centers. The scammers utilized messages and phone calls, often impersonating figures of authority to redirect victims to fake websites. There, the victims would share confidential banking information. OCBC responded by reimbursing victims in a one-time goodwill gesture, removing clickable links in their emails and messages, as well as investing in their own cybersecurity program for their employees. The key stakeholders in this issue are the victims who suffer financial distress from these scams and look to recover their financial losses, the scammers who commit the scam for various reasons, the banks who are custodians of the victim's assets, and regulators that intend to maintain the well-being of society. Now, let's move on to ethical dilemmas. The key issues we will tackle are: is it ethical to scam? Does motivation justify scamming? Who bears the responsibility to prevent scams? And who should be responsible for compensating the victims? Before we analyze the issue, let's watch a short skit.
Hello?
Hello, am I speaking with Gerald?
Yes, this is Auntie Gerald.
Hello, Auntie Gerald. This is Joel from the Security Department at OCBC. So we noticed some suspicious activity on your account, and I just need to verify a few things to ensure that your funds are safe.
Okay. Are you sure you're from my bank?
Of course. We take security very seriously. So I just want to confirm a few details with you so we can lock down your account, okay?
So what do you need?
Okay, can you confirm your last 4 digits of your NIC?
My last 4 digits, 7890.
Okay, perfect. So thank you. So we noticed the transfer attempt of about 3.5k. So to block it, we need to send a verification code to your phone. So once you receive it, right, can you let me know the code?
Have already. The code is 4270.
Okay, thank you so much, Gerald. So I've just blocked the transfer, right? So there's one more thing before I hang up. Could you confirm your card's expiration date just to match it to our records?
Expiration date, 1125.
Okay, thank you so much. That's all we need. So your account is secure now. If there's anything else, don't hesitate to call us back.
Wow, heng, thank you so much.
Hey, no problem. Anytime, Gerald. Call me anytime. Take care.
So let's look at bank scams through a utilitarian perspective. Scammers gain financial benefits through these scams, sometimes managing to gain over $213,000 from a single victim. Victims suffer significant financial stress and, in many cases, lose their savings. Scams often involve obtaining personal and confidential information, which is a serious invasion of privacy. In one instance, over 1,000 UOB clients had their bank information leaked after an employee fell for a scam. These breaches of trust and privacy lead to a loss of confidence in the bank, harming the reputation and business. Thus, utilitarianism would conclude that the financial gain for one does not justify the financial, emotional, and reputational losses for many. This would make scamming unethical. Now let's analyze this issue from a principle-based viewpoint. In Singapore, the law is clear. It is illegal to cheat or scam someone. Legally, scamming is defined as any act that deceives a person into handing over assets. This is in line with Kantian ethics, which emphasizes universal moral obligations. Scamming breaks unconditional duties like honesty and respect for others' property. Scamming thus goes against the moral expectations of society. Given the clear violation of the rules which uphold the principle-based argument of ethics, scamming would be deemed unethical. Now, virtue ethics evaluates whether an action is ethical by focusing on whether it aligns with an individual's character and internal moral compass. In this framework, virtues like honesty and compassion guide our judgment about the ethicality of actions. When looking at scamming through this lens, it becomes clear that the scamming embodies negative virtues, such as greed and dishonesty. These actions would thus be in direct conflict with positive virtues. According to virtue ethics, this failure to act in alignment with good virtues would make scamming unethical. From our group's point of view, utilitarianism concludes that the harm done will outweigh any good. Principle-based and virtue-based ethics conclude that scamming infringes on key moral obligations and virtues. As a result, our group is of the opinion that scamming would be deemed unethical.
Now we'll be moving on to ethical issue 2. Does motivation justify the act of scamming? We will assume that most scammers mean to obtain money for a justified cause like survival. For instance, most scam workers are illegally recruited under the pretense of high-paying job opportunities. Now let's watch a short skit to help you visualize.
I asked you to scam 100 people. How many have you scammed? You're useless.
First, let's discuss this using utilitarianism. We could argue that since these scammers are being forced to scam, they may be doing so out of survival rather than malicious intent. As such, their choice to scam may be driven by a survival instinct, not a desire to harm. Additionally, scamming could be considered as the lesser evil if it prevents greater harm like torture and death. For example, Mr. Kamugisha, who was imprisoned and forced to scam against his will, claimed that scam workers were made to work 18 hours a day without any day offs. Thus, scamming would be the better alternative if it ensures the scammer's survival. Moreover, scammers might come from poorer backgrounds compared to their victims. While bank scam victims may lose their savings in a scam, they usually still have enough resources to survive. Hence, we could argue that the scammer's actions are justified since it would lead to the greatest good. However, it is worth noting that if the intention behind the scamming is malicious, where they scam just because it's easy money, their actions would no longer be justified. Therefore, utilitarianism would say that their actions would be justified. Now we'll be moving on to principle-based ethics. Since some scammers are being held against their will, their human rights to be protected against forced labor have been violated. This suggests that a moral responsibility on the scammer's part might not exist since the scammers did not have a choice to scam others. However, from a principle-based perspective, there might be some ethical implications. If we look at scamming as a whole, it can be considered unethical. This is due to the fact that scammers are using the victims as a means to their survival, which violates the principle of treating humans with respect. Even though these scammers are acting for their survival, their actions still involve theft and deception, which regardless of motivation still violate key moral obligations and laws. Thus, principle-based ethics would say that it is unethical to scam, even if the scammers are scamming for survival. Now we'll be moving on to virtue ethics. In virtue ethics, Aristotle suggests that one should navigate within difficult situations to achieve the ideal behavior known as the golden mean. This means that one should avoid extremes of excess or deficiency. It would be excessive for a scammer who is coerced into scamming to submit to fear and support the scam organization, but deficient if they refuse to take part in the scam, which could result in torture or even death. The fact that these scammers were deceived and held against their own will suggests that they might be acting as ethically as they can. Therefore, according to the golden mean rule, it is possible that these scammers may have been acting morally right. However, we must not ignore the fact that the act of scamming is still a practice that goes against virtues such as honesty and fairness. Even if the scammer has a positive motivation behind the unethical act, it still remains an unethical act. Thus, virtue ethics would suggest that it is unethical for scammers to scam, even if they had valid reasons to do so. From our group's point of view, we believe that the scammers should choose not to scam. Our reason is that these scammers are living in terrible conditions, and regardless of whether they choose to scam or not, they remain captives of the scam leaders. Even if they engage in scamming to avoid torture, this might only provide temporary relief. The reality is that they are still trapped, which means that their actions don't really lead to true happiness. In this case, it seems that not scamming would be a better choice. Not only would it avoid causing financial harm to innocent victims, but it could also allow the scammers to maintain some sense of moral integrity, which might lead to a greater long-term well-being, even in a difficult situation.
Now, let's watch a video to give you an idea on who should bear the duty of preventing scams.
My money all gone. My money all gone. It's not your fault. This is not your fault, okay? He clicked his link himself. That's his own problem.
Yeah, it's not our fault. You should know that we don't ask for your personal details. We can't babysit you 24/7. But my money all gone. My money all gone.
That's too bad. You'll never get your money back. At the end of the day, I win.
Wait a minute. So it's you. You're the scammer.
Really?
The government have a duty to protect our citizens from harm. We will enact new laws today. Scammers will face at least 6 months in jail. Banks have to adhere to the minimum requirements in the anti-scam legislation. And telcos, you are responsible for filtering these scam messages and calls. As the government, we have the responsibility to educate the public on anti-scam prevention. We all have a role to play in combating scams.
The video shows that the government is responsible in preventing scams. Now let's dive into the framework to analyze why is that so. From the bank's perspective, They have a lot of resources at their disposal. They can improve fraud detection and control systems and also educate customers through media campaigns such as the Be a Pro Against Cons. However, banks might struggle due to the limited access they have to customer-sensitive information and also the legal loopholes that let banks evade their responsibilities. From the customer's perspective, it is their own responsibility to remain vigilant when conducting online transactions. Campaigns and initiatives are already made known in high human traffic areas such as MRT stations, bus stops, and social media. Tools such as the money lock feature are already provided to prevent scams from gaining access to your money. However, most reported cases typically involve less tech-savvy consumers, especially the elderly. They lack the technical know-how to protect themselves against the scams. The government, on the other hand, is uniquely positioned to create a safer environment for the public at large, benefiting the overall well-being. The government also have the power to enact initiatives that have far-reaching impacts, such as the anti-scam framework, which reduced SMS scams by 70%. And the principle-based argument supports this too. The government has an ethical duty to protect its citizens from harm, especially in its role as a gatekeeper of public welfare. Since the government is elected to serve and protect society, it should set and enforce regulation that deters scams and enhance consumer safety. For example, the government have held banks accountable by requiring them to meet minimum anti-scam standards, as when MAS mandated OCBC to invest $330 million to address its deficiencies. The disadvantages, however, is that the government cannot enact laws to cover all of the scams committed. It is also costly to implement such a framework, but its role as a protector of public safety justify these expenses. To conclude, the primary responsibility for scam prevention should lie with the government under the principle-based and utilitarian framework. Because they were voted to put in power, they are an institution with legislative power, they have also the spending power, and they have the responsibility to protect society as a whole. Thus, the government should bear the responsibility of preventing scams.
From a CSR perspective, Level 1 emphasizes a bank's duty to not cause harm by exercising due care and avoiding negligence. For Level 2, the duty to prevent harm, the government is most relevant through their fiduciary duty to protect citizens. They do so by implementing laws and regulations, as seen here. In doing so, they exert influence over various stakeholders to do their part in combating scams. Our consensus is that Level 1 is a baseline responsibility of basic compliance, whereas Level 2 is more important as it alludes to preventive measures. The various agencies play a crucial role as detailed here, and thus have a bigger responsibility. To conclude issue 3, the stakeholders all have a part to play, but based on the 4 perspectives, we repeatedly find that the government should shoulder the biggest burden of responsibility, and this is reasonable given their fiduciary duties and resources available.
Moving on to our last ethical issue, whether banks have the responsibility for compensation towards victims. So, diving right into the utilitarian argument, we must first establish that customers have the right to compensation. This is because of the uneven financial ability between the customer and the government or banks, as both entities have considerable financial reserves to cover such losses. If victims are not compensated, only the banks will benefit slightly, as they can save an insignificant amount of money compared to a victim's personal losses. Conversely, victims' losses can also impact their families due to the sudden loss of financial stability going against the greatest good. If the government is responsible for compensation, this disrespects the rights of taxpayers, as they do not get to consent and can lead to great dissatisfaction and unhappiness among the population. Furthermore, this can be seen as an opportunity cost, as money spent by the government to provide restitution could have been better used towards a more urgent area of need. Banks, on the other hand, have substantial financial resources and can earn goodwill as well as boost their reputation among stakeholders. They will also be incentivized to innovate on their preventive measures to help prevent more scam victims from rising on their platforms due to possessing liability for losses. Lastly, governments will also be able to redirect resources towards other areas, promoting efficient use of resources. Therefore, to advance the greatest good, banks should compensate victims as it benefits all parties in the long run. Moving on to the principles-based argument, currently there is no existing legislation in Singapore that requires local banks to compensate victims. This will change with the upcoming shared responsibility framework that will be enacted in December of this year. The framework assigns responsibility of victims' losses to telcos and banks based on if they have fulfilled their rightful duties to protect the victims through preventive measures. Most banks currently compensate victims out of goodwill towards their customers. As they are currently not required by law to compensate, it is not unethical of banks to not provide compensation, as they are not violating any moral duties like justice. This is further supported by libertarianism, as regulation on compensation can be considered unethical, as banks should be given the liberty to choose to compensate victims. In conclusion, banks should not be held responsible to compensate victims, as there are no rules and regulations to enforce it, and it is not unethical for banks to choose not to compensate under principle-based ethics.
Next, we will assess this issue using CSR. From theory, we know that the third level of CSR describes an organization's duty to do good for society, and we believe that this duty to do good for society will require banks to compensate scam victims. Now, our view arises from the fact that banks compensating scam victims ensures that the relationship between banks and customers remain mutually beneficial. The banks as custodians of customers' money benefit financially. As such, we find it fair that since they have gained financially, there should also be a financial responsibility to help customers in their time of need by compensating them. Furthermore, banks also attain enlightened self-interest by compensating scam victims, as this act of giving back to society can benefit them in terms of strengthening relationships with customers, as well as building reputation and goodwill with broader audiences, which can then allow the bank to do well by doing good. We will then conclude our analysis of this ethical issue. Overall, we've covered 3 key areas of ethics when analyzing the ethical issue of compensating scam victims. Firstly, we covered the utilitarianism view, which concluded that it is in the greater good for banks to compensate scam victims. The CSR view also supports the fact that banks have the responsibility to do good and should compensate scam victims as well. However, on the contrary, we found that the principle-based ethics view provided a contrasting view due to the lack of existing rules and regulations to hold banks accountable for compensating scam victims. Overall, as a group, however, we felt that it is still the bank's responsibility to do so of compensating scam victims, and even though there may be no rules governing compensation, this does not absolve a bank's responsibility to do good, and the fact still remains that the maximum good is obtained if the banks do decide to compensate scam victims. With that, we've now concluded our analysis of ethical issues, and we'll be moving on to the group's recommendation on how to tackle the issue of bank impersonation scams in Singapore.
So let's take a look at the first recommendation. The first recommendation is to enhance educational programs so that they specifically target vulnerable groups, the elderly and younger adults. Targeting educational posters or roadshows at frequently visited locations like hawker centers, void decks, and community centers can help reach our vulnerable groups. Furthermore, anti-scam ads should be displayed on most used apps by our groups, such as LinkedIn and TikTok.
We can use AI to prevent scams. Just like how scammers use AI, banks and the government can use AI to combat them too. NLP allows us to analyze commonly used language and flag up suspicious messages for further review. Furthermore, machine learning algorithms help detect unusual patterns in consumer behavior. There are numerous efficiency benefits to be reaped, but in terms of limitations, it may take a while to implement and refine. There are also concerns on the ethicality of AI detection. Thus, it is imperative that users utilize ethical frameworks in the incorporation of technology. Moreover, it is crucial to maintain the privacy and security of the information fed.
For our last recommendation, we wanted to focus on the compensation of scam victims and ways which we could potentially try to enhance the avenues for scam victims to seek compensation. This led us to comparing the existing legislation for compensation and the upcoming shared responsibility framework which govern compensation for scam victims. Current legislation does not require banks to compensate scam victims, and all compensation are done on a goodwill basis. The new shared responsibility framework, however, which will be implemented in December of this year, provides clear guidelines on when banks or telcos will be liable to compensate scam victims. This analysis helps us to identify the fact that even though the new shared responsibility framework can help to provide avenues for victims to seek compensation, its scope is still rather limited to only banks and telcos. As such, we recommend that the scope of this framework should be enhanced to cover digital platforms such as Facebook and Google, who also contribute to bank impersonation scams as seen in the picture shown. Doing so can help to further protect consumers and bolster compensation avenues for victims. With that said, there will of course be limitations which exist. As with every piece of legislation, it's impossible to cover all possible scenarios, and there won't be scenarios where victims cannot seek compensation due to it not being covered by the framework. For example, if the victim were deceived into physically giving away their credentials in person, they will not be entitled to seek compensation as part of this framework. With this, we will now give a quick conclusion and summary of our presentation. So for our presentation, we first started off by addressing the case background of impersonation scams in Singapore. We then discussed the stakeholders involved, and then we analyzed 4 key ethical issues identified. Lastly, we provided recommendations with an emphasis on education, prevention, and compensation. Through our presentation, we hope that everyone has learned more about the ethics behind bank impersonation scams, and we thank you for your time and your attention. Thank you.